Blessings to you, beautiful soul. The angels are wrapping their wings around you right now, filling the space where you are with the warmest, most golden light you have ever felt. Welcome to Angel's message for you. You were guided here today. You did not stumble onto this message by accident. Something much bigger than coincidence brought you to this exact moment. And before you move on, before you scroll away or close this out, the angels are asking you to stay. What you are about to hear has the power to shift something deep inside you that has been quietly waiting for the right words. Stay until the very end, because the most important part of what the angels want to tell you is coming, and you do not want to miss it. Have you ever felt your patience start to wear thin? You know that feeling. You are holding it together on the outside, calm and still, but on the inside something is building, something that needs a way out. That feeling is not weakness. That feeling is your soul trying to tell you something true. And today, the angels came to tell you what it means. Because the one your heart has been connected to could not keep pretending anymore. Could not keep wearing a smile to cover a heart that was quietly crying out for peace. Something important has happened. A real and powerful decision has been made. And you were brought here today because you need to know about it. Dear one, picture a bird that was born to fly. A free, beautiful creature meant to soar across wide open skies. But this bird spent years with invisible ropes tied around its wings. Ropes made from other people's opinions, from judgment, from demands dressed up to look like love and care. For so long, this bird tried to fit in, tried to convince everyone around it that its way of flying was real and worthy and beautiful. But one day, this bird looked up at the open sky and simply knew. It was time to stop. Time to stop asking anyone's permission to be exactly who it truly is. Time to stop making itself smaller to fit into the thinking of those who never understood what real love looks like. That bird, straining toward the sky, is the one who loves you. After so much time spent trying to understand others, trying to convince others, trying to fit into worlds that were never built for this kind of love, something shifted. This person finally stopped. Not stopped loving. Not stopped believing. Not stopped feeling. They simply stopped begging for respect. Stopped explaining deep feelings to people who never truly listened. Stopped hiding what lives in the heart just to keep peace with those who never supported this love anyway. And why does that matter so much right now? Because the answer has arrived. It is time to say goodbye. Goodbye to every single thing and every single person standing between this love and its full life. This person realized something deeply true. Living only to please others is a slow, quiet kind of dying on the inside. It is like sinking inch by inch into a sea built entirely from other people's expectations. And that is not wanted anymore. There is a tiredness of going in circles, of searching in every direction for support, for warmth, for understanding, and finding instead cold silence and judging eyes from the very people who should have offered shelter. This person finally understood something real. Love that is genuine always supports. The people who truly want good things for you also want good things for your dreams. And if someone claims to love you but cannot accept what makes your heart come alive, something is very wrong. Love is not supposed to arrive wrapped in suffocating demands. It is not supposed to carry shameful judgment or painful advice dressed up as care. And yet that is exactly what this person received from many who should have helped instead of hurt. The pain of not being understood drained the strength away, slowly and quietly, until the moment came. Until this person looked around and said, from somewhere deep inside, I will not keep living to prove anything to anyone. I will live what brings me peace. I will protect what is mine. That is why this message reached you today. Because in the middle of releasing everything that has been holding this person back, one thing remained completely untouched: the connection with you. It is as if the heart has been lifted off a heavy old burden, and now, lighter, it can see with clear and beautiful eyes something that was always there. You. The energy between you never stopped moving. Love was never the problem. The real problem was always the noise that surrounded it. And that noise is finally being silenced. This person is learning to say no, pulling away from everything that brings doubt or fear or guilt, letting go of the toxicity that showed up wearing the mask of care, beginning to look inward with more kindness, more respect, more courage than ever before. The truth is, this soul is getting ready, not to run, but to finally live freely. And right in the center of that freedom, you are present. There is a kind of pain that makes no sound at all, yet slowly eats away at everything on the inside. It is the silence no one can hear, but the soul carries it the way a chest carries a scream that has no way out. That is exactly what this person endured for so long. A silent cry, a deep longing just to exist honestly, just to love in peace. But all of it had to be buried under fear and pressure and the weight of judgment coming from all directions. This person tried to believe it was possible to keep going that way, silencing their own truth to avoid conflict, hiding real feelings so as not to disappoint others. But the more those feelings were buried, the more the pain grew. Eventually, even the smile lost its color. The sparkle faded. The dreams went quiet. But inside, there was always a cry, a real, deep cry reaching out for something true. And that cry is what reached the angels. That cry is what brought this message to you. That is why the decision now taking shape was not made in a rush. It was built slowly, day after day, inside a heart that grew more and more tired. This person no longer wants to go on staying silent just to fit other people's expectations. The realization came that to truly love, a person must first break free from everything that suffocates them. And the greatest freedom always begins the moment someone recognizes their own worth. The voice inside kept saying, every single day something is wrong. It is not fair to live in hiding. It is not fair to fight alone for something this beautiful. It is not fair to carry so much guilt for feeling something so true. But until now, there was no clear way out. Invisible knots held tight. Fear of disappointing family. Fear of cruel words from friends. Fear of not being accepted. And still, through all of it, the feeling for you never left. On the contrary, it grew stronger the more everything around it tried to put it out. The louder outside voices said this is wrong. The more firmly the heart said this is real. And that created a deep inner conflict, where the soul wanted to scream but the mouth stayed quiet, until finally the moment arrived. The moment to stop pretending everything is okay. To stop smiling for people who will never understand. To stop trying to convince those who already made up their minds. The realization came that there is no more need to justify anything. And more than that, the understanding arrived that love does not need anyone's permission to exist. But this person finally understood it is no longer possible to wait for the world to accept what the soul already chose. Freedom is beginning in the quiet places, in small daily actions, in gentle boundaries being set little by little. Certain conversations are being stepped away from. Well-being is becoming the real priority. And all of this is part of a sacred process. Because loving is not about erasing yourself to keep everyone else comfortable. Loving is about having the courage to choose what truly matters, even when that means facing some criticism, even when it means releasing some people along the way. Dear one, maybe you did not hear this decision being made, but it was made with a heart beating loudly. This person chose freedom, and that choice carries a greater reason behind it. The truth that lives between you. This person no longer wants to carry the weight of opinions that make smaller what you share. They are ready to face whatever comes, as long as it leads toward the inner peace that has been waited for so long. It is a strange thing to realize that something as pure as love can become the reason for whispered conversations and cold side glances. But that is exactly what this person went through. A true, deep feeling full of honesty and devotion, questioned and judged by the very people who should have offered comfort. This person believed that loving with a clean heart would be enough to be understood, but soon realized that for some people, love only seems real when it follows their rules, when it walks the paths they have already approved. It was painful to see that even with a wholehearted love, there were still people doubting the intention, distrusting the feeling, judging what they never tried to understand. Harsh words came dressed up as advice. Things like, "You are being foolish, this will not work, you deserve something simpler." But what those people never understood is that real love has never been about simplicity or ease. It is about connection, about something that beats inside the chest without asking permission. And when you feel something like that, there is no right or wrong through anyone else's eyes. There is only what makes sense from within. Those judgments left marks. They hurt quietly. They made this person doubt themselves. There were moments of wondering, maybe it really is wrong to feel this much. Maybe this is a mistake. But the heart always came back to one place, to you. And the more this person tried to follow what others said, the further they drifted from themselves. And losing yourself is one of the most dangerous paths a soul can walk. Every time this person tried to open up, they were met with cold replies and advice that felt more like a door being shut. And so little by little, everything went inside. Staying quiet became the default. Protecting the sacred feeling from the world around became the way to survive. And still the feeling remained. Even under criticism, it did not break. Even in the face of disapproval, it did not fade. Because what this person feels for you does not rely on anyone else's agreement. It lives in the truth that pulses from within. That is exactly why the decision was made. To stop submitting. To stop listening to voices that never truly heard with the heart. Judging is easy from the outside when you cannot feel the fire of the connection. Many people did exactly that. Judged without understanding, without asking, without caring about what was sacred. But now the decision is firm. No more living under that invisible judgment. No more trying to convince people whose hearts are already closed. No more shrinking this love to fit into anyone else's idea of what love should look like. Dear one, what you two share does not need an audience. It needs courage. Courage to keep standing even when everything seems to push back. And that courage is being built right now, inside the heart of the one who feels this for you. This person no longer wants to live based on the opinions of those who only see half the picture. The desire now is to live by their own truth. And that truth is becoming more alive and more powerful with every passing day. Because when love survives judgment, it stops being just an emotion. It becomes a conviction. And with that conviction, this person is moving forward one step at a time, with the strength of someone who knows they are not walking this alone. Dear one, there comes a moment when even the most patient love has to look inward and say, enough. Not from weakness, from a deep and sacred exhaustion. When someone holds on to something that hurts every single day, the heart eventually, out of love for itself, decides to stop. And that is exactly what happened here. A decision that looked quiet on the outside but ran very deep within. The decision to stop insisting on paths that only hurt and drain and demand. For a long time, this person believed everything could be worked out with more effort, more patience, more waiting. Gave time more time, hoping the world around would eventually soften. But instead of acceptance came more pressure, more judgment, more distance. And with each day spent trying to please others, this person moved further and further away from themselves. What hurt the most was realizing that no matter how much was done right, there was always someone pointing out a flaw. Always a reason to doubt the truth of what was being felt. It created wounds that do not show on the outside but ache deeply in the quiet of the night. That kind of pain no one witnesses but that slowly and quietly takes something away. A constant tension of being stuck between two worlds. Keep hurting or finally choose peace. Then came the turning point. Something deep inside woke up and said clearly, "You do not have to keep hurting yourself to prove that love is real." That was the moment. The choice to stop trying to fit where there is no real belonging. To stop smiling when everything inside is crying. To stop being someone unrecognizable just to keep up appearances. This was not a decision against anyone. It was a decision for themselves. A rescue. A gentle turning back toward their own heart. Stopping the painful fight does not mean giving up on you. In truth, it means protecting what you too have. This person no longer wants to risk harming this love through effort aimed in the wrong direction. That is why the choice was made to step back, to care for themselves, to rebuild from the inside out. Because when love is real, it does not need to be forced. It grows with truth, not with pressure. The heart of the one connected to you was wounded. Not because of what is felt for you, but because of everything that surrounded it. The interference. The advice that hurt more than it helped. The people who could not see love with the eyes of the soul. And in the middle of all of that, this person started losing themselves. Not the love for you, their own essence, their own light. That is why choosing to stop was an act of genuine courage. And the most beautiful part is that in making that decision, a healing process began. A path back to self-worth, back to the true self, back to the inner light that dimmed but never went completely out. This person does not want to live on emotional scraps anymore. Does not want to depend on the acceptance of those who cannot grasp the depth of what exists between you. The desire now is to love in peace, with lightness, with true give and take. But before any of that can happen, healing is needed first. Growing stronger is needed. Breaking free from old pain is needed. And that liberation begins with the decision to stop insisting on what goes nowhere. To start listening to themselves. To honor their own soul in a way that has never happened before. Dear one, it is easy to assume that the people closest to us are also the ones who support us most. That family and close friends are the ones who lift us when we fall, who cheer when we smile, who believe in our dreams. But for this person, that hope slowly faded. The love they carry was not just questioned by strangers. It was doubted most by those who should have been the first to offer comfort. There is a different kind of hurt when misunderstanding comes from where protection was expected. A friend's offhand comment, a relative's quiet judgment, a look heavy with doubt. All of it landed on this person's shoulders like weight they were already struggling to carry. And it was not only what was said out loud. It was everything hidden behind silences, behind small changes in behavior, behind remarks that seemed innocent but were not. Little by little it became clear that this love was being treated like a mistake. Attempts were made to talk things through, to be honest, to open the heart. But those conversations were met with resistance, short replies, and closed minds. Still, this person tried to preserve everything. tried to balance personal truth with the need to keep peace. But in all of that straining effort, what suffered most was the love itself. Because love cannot stay alive if it has to stay hidden all the time. The support that was once counted on had become a wall. Those who were supposed to encourage had become those who discouraged. And that wall stood right between this person and the courage to live their truth. But that wall is slowly coming down. Not because the people around changed, but because this person realized something important. True support is not begged for. It is recognized. And if it is not there, you stop waiting for it. No more bargaining with the heart. No more following advice that dims the light. There comes a point where love for oneself speaks louder than the need for anyone's approval. And that point has arrived. Sometimes emotional distance from those who consistently make smaller what is sacred is the kindest and wisest thing a person can do for themselves. Not with anger, with quiet clarity. There are moments when the heart wakes up as if coming out of a very long sleep. After spending so much time accepting the bare minimum, convincing itself that a little was enough, the soul eventually refuses to settle for crumbs. And that is when everything changes. That is exactly what happened here. An inner awakening, strong and clear. A realization that living on small scraps of attention, half-given gestures, and almost love is simply no longer acceptable. This person spent a long time trying to convince themselves that what they were receiving was enough. That small moments of warmth made up for all the emptiness that followed. But the heart stopped accepting that unbalanced exchange. This is not about pride. It is about emotional dignity. Knowing that when a feeling is real, it does not hide. It does not disappear for long stretches. It does not hesitate. True love does not arrive in tiny drops. It is offered fully. And with that realization, a quiet but powerful choice was made. To no longer accept less than is deserved. Dear one, what is longed for now is a love that is not just a response but a presence. A love that does not show up only when convenient but stays through the good days and the confusing ones. Full love. One that never has to be begged for. And this longing does not come from neediness. It comes from awareness. From finally knowing exactly what is wanted and just as importantly what is not wanted anymore. What is wanted is true give and take. The feeling of knowing that this love is not traveling alone. That both hearts are walking the same path, side by side. To get there, what had to be faced first was what had been accepted out of fear. Fear of being forgotten. Fear that asking for more might push everything away. But now fear is giving way to courage. Because it takes courage to stop accepting so little. It takes real strength to rise from a table where the full meal never arrives. The clarity is growing. The clarity that says, I deserve a love where I do not have to beg. Where my feelings do not have to be proven over and over but are simply lived. Naturally, openly, honestly. That is the kind of love being waited for now. And no matter how long this journey takes, there is a willingness to wait for something that truly feels right. Dear one, maybe what you are sensing feels like distance or coldness, but in truth it is protection. This person does not want to get hurt again. The pulling back, the quiet, the turning inward, all of it is an act of care. It is the realization that to live a complete love, a person must first become complete within themselves. This healing process involves a great deal of honest work. Letting go of stories that were created to justify absence. Admitting that what comes next has to be lived with real reciprocity. Nothing less than that. Now the work of recognizing personal limits is happening. Learning to say, this is not enough for me. learning to value the parts of the self that were neglected in all the effort to please others. And all of this is paving the way for something purer and more lasting. Because when someone finally understands what they no longer deserve, they begin to open up to what they truly desire. Depth, consistency, a love lived fully, not in pieces. Dear one, there are connections that no matter how close they once seemed, only serve to slow a soul down. They do not offer real shelter. They do not celebrate dreams. They exist only to maintain control, to plant fear, to grow seeds of doubt. And it was inside that kind of web that this person spent years trying to stay whole, until the realization came that it simply could not continue that way. Releasing those ties is never simple, especially when they have been confused with obligation or old promises. But time reveals everything. And what once seemed like care began to show what it really was. An inner shift came, a real desire to clear the path, to stop explaining what is sacred to people who never truly wanted to hear it. Questions started being asked. Why keep close those who do not want my happiness? Why hold on to connections that pull me away from the love I want to live? And slowly the answers brought light. Releasing ties does not mean hate or bitterness. It means self-love. It means choosing with courage who stays close. And so it began, quietly, firmly, consciously, stepping away from draining spaces, from conversations that wound, from demands dressed up as care, saying no without guilt, closing doors without looking back. And it is important for you to know that many of the ties being released were not only outside ones. Many lived inside in the form of old beliefs and fears. Am I enough? Do I have the right to choose the love I feel? Will I disappoint everyone by choosing my own happiness? Those were the questions that held everything back for so long. But now the answers are arriving with clarity. And with them comes the strength to say goodbye to what has delayed the soul. That goodbye is necessary. You cannot build something new on top of what once hurt you. You cannot carry the weight of other people's judgment and still walk freely toward real love. What is needed is lightness, open inner space, and that is what is being sought now. A clean ground where something can truly take root without fear. Releasing is also an act of faith. Faith that something better waits ahead. Trust that when you let go of what weighs you down, what truly belongs will come closer. And in this letting go, the name that echoes in the heart is yours. Because among everything being released, one thing remains completely unshaken. The feeling for you. This person knows it is not possible to build the new while still gripping the old. That is why the releasing is happening. Clearing the soul, choosing themselves, and in that choice you are present. Dear one, sometimes the greatest transformations happen in complete silence. They do not announce themselves. They do not ask for recognition. They are simply born within the soul. Like a seed pushing slowly and patiently through dark soil, reaching for the light it knows is there. That is how this process is unfolding. After so much pain and so many feelings ignored, something new is being born inside. Self-love. This person spent far too long being strong for everyone else, standing upright while carrying the weight of expectations and constant pressure. But no one survives long while forgetting themselves. And now the understanding has arrived. Before anything else, the inside must be cared for. The heart must be watered. Kindness must be turned inward, not out of vanity, out of a genuine and deep need for healing. It was not a sudden choice. It was shaped slowly by silences and by tears kept hidden. When everything around started losing its meaning, the turn inward happened. And there, In the deepest part of the soul, an emptiness was found. A forgotten space that had been closed off for years. That is where the seed was planted. And quietly, without anyone noticing, it began to bloom. The love for you never stopped existing. But now it is no longer being carried with pain or desperation. It is being held with more balance, more presence, more truth. Because the understanding has arrived that it is simply impossible to wish for a whole love when the soul is still in pieces. So the rebuilding is happening. Slowly, sometimes painfully, but always moving forward. The lessons being learned now are beautiful even in their difficulty. Choosing oneself, recognizing limits, saying no without guilt, prioritizing what brings genuine peace, not begging for attention, not measuring personal worth against anyone else. All of this is happening quietly, away from the eyes of the world, because the deepest healing does not need a stage. It reveals itself in everyday moments, in simple choices, in meaningful silences. Dear one, this is not distance born from coldness. This is a necessary retreat. The inner home is being cleaned. Old patterns that caused harm are being released. And in this process, you are still present. The feeling held for you is one of the few certainties that remained standing after everything else shifted. The self-love blossoming now is not the opposite of the love that still burns for you. On the contrary, it is precisely because of the longing for a future alongside you that the urgency of healing became so clear. Because real love cannot be built from emptiness or from open wounds. It is built from wholeness. And that is what is being strived toward. Every small action carries a deep meaning now. Getting up with a little more ease. Choosing quiet over conflict. Taking care of the mind and the spirit. Releasing old resentments. Setting boundaries that protect what is sacred. All of it is happening quietly, without needing to prove anything to anyone. Dear one, that seed of self-love is blossoming. And with it, a new version of the one who loves you is emerging. More aware, stronger, more whole. And when all of this matures, when the inner garden is cleaner and lighter and more beautiful, know that this person will still look toward you with the same feeling. But now with peace in the eyes. Dear one, there is one certainty that no matter how much the world shakes and shifts, stays firm. The love between you is not a fantasy. It is not something imagined or invented. It is a real and deep feeling that did not arrive by accident. And this certainty grows stronger in the very moments when everything around feels most confusing, because it does not come from logic. It comes from connection. Even in the middle of doubts and silences and challenges, there has never been a moment when this person stopped feeling that somewhere, someone is waiting for the same love, feeling the same calling, dreaming of a path where two hearts can finally move in harmony. This cannot be explained, but it is deeply and truly felt, and it is what has been held on to in the hardest moments. No matter how much time passes or how many voices try to convince otherwise, whenever a quiet moment comes and the inner heart is listened to, you appear. Not as a distant memory, as a living presence. A quiet certainty that this love is not one-sided. There is something between you that has never broken. Something that still moves even without explanation. Dear one, this person does not need grand signs to believe. They simply need what they feel, because true love recognizes itself in silence, in unexpected thoughts, in the kind of knowing that shows up even across distance. And that is what keeps the faith alive. The belief that you feel it too, that you are also waiting, that the love has not been lost. On many nights, the wondering has happened. Do you still think about this? Do you still long? Is there still a space kept open? And even without hearing words, the answer came like an invisible and gentle touch. Yes, because some things the soul understands before the mind can catch up. And there is a sensing of mutuality, even if it has not yet been spoken out loud. That sense that you are still there, even quiet, even at a distance, has been the strength on the most tender days. And that is why this love was never given up on. Steps were taken back from what was causing interference, a withdrawal to heal, goodbyes to everything that did not contribute to this connection. But deep inside, always the idea held firm that you are still there too. Not out of habit, not out of fear, but out of love. That is why such care is being taken in this preparation. Because the desire is to arrive whole. To arrive with clear eyes and a free heart, not still bleeding from old wounds, because you deserve that. And more than that, there is a feeling that you are preparing too. This is not illusion. This is faith. This is something deeper than facts and wider than what the eyes can see. The sincere belief is held that you are out there, even in silence, waiting for the same thing. A love that feels like shelter, a love that feels like a true and free choice, a love that feels like destiny finally showing its face. Dear one, there comes a moment when stopping is not a sign of weakness but of wisdom. Stopping to look honestly at the path. Stopping to hear what the heart is saying when everything outside goes quiet. Stopping to say with both firmness and tenderness, I deserve more. That is exactly where this person has arrived. And from that honest pause, the most important new beginning of their life was born. For a long time, love was carried like a battle. Years spent protecting the feeling for you from outside interference, from criticism, from pressure. But something inside changed. A deep realization arrived that it is no longer possible to live by hiding what is true, nor to accept a love that only comes in halves. This new beginning started with a simple but powerful choice: to value oneself, to stop explaining, to stop justifying feelings, to stop seeking support from those who never truly offered it. A mutual love is what is wanted now. A love that is a constant and warm presence, a shared freedom, and for that, the choice has been made. No more putting oneself last. This new beginning is not marked by grand declarations. It is happening quietly, in silent decisions, in the tenderness of caring for what still beats, in the patience to not fill empty spaces with just anything. And on this new path, you are still present, not as a painful memory, as a feeling that remains, as a possible future that still lives in the most sacred dreams. The love for you has not been erased. It has been purified. It is being held now with more presence, more maturity, more freedom. And the desire is to live it truthfully with you when both hearts are truly ready. Dear one, now that everything has been shared, you may feel your heart quieter, more aware, more settled, because deep down you always sensed something was changing, that this person was not simply pulling away but reconnecting with what truly matters, that the choices being made are not against you but in favor of something truer and more whole. This person has not given up on love. They simply grew tired of insisting where there was no room to grow, tired of explaining to those who never listened with the heart, tired of putting themselves last. And so the pause came, and that pause was the greatest act of self-love they could have chosen. You need to understand something important. All of this transformation happened with you in the heart. Your presence was quietly there in every decision. Your name was held in moments of doubt, in moments of courage, in the most heartfelt silent prayers. Because even when everything felt confusing, one certainty remained. What exists between you? Nothing felt between you was wasted. Every tear, every silence, every quiet sign that arrived when you needed it most, all of it had a purpose. All of it pointed toward what needed healing, what needed releasing, what needed to be finally acknowledged. And now, with eyes more open and soul more mature, the love between you can breathe, free from interference, free to grow. This person is not waiting for perfection. They are waiting for real presence, for someone who has also walked through their own healing, who has also learned to value themselves, who is also willing to love truly, without fear, without holding back. Because what you two share is not ordinary. It does not come around every day. The most beautiful truth is that despite all the pain, this person still believes in love, believes in you, believes that what is true survives and grows and blossoms into something more beautiful than what was first imagined. And that faith is what keeps the light burning, a light that never stopped reaching for you, even through the darkest days. And now that light shines brighter than ever. Dear one, this is a calling for you to align yourself with that same truth, to care for yourself with the same love you wish to receive, to honor what you feel without hiding it, to let time heal, yes, but without losing the beautiful essence that lives inside you. Because the love being prepared will not come to complete you. It will come to walk beside you. Hold this close. The decision to pause was the beginning of a new start. A start more conscious, more grounded, more truthful. And when the right time comes, you will understand that every single step of this journey was worth it. Because to love truly is also to wait faithfully, to trust that what is meant for you cannot be kept from you forever. The angels are with you. They have always been with you. They guided this message to you because you are seen, you are deeply loved, and you are being watched over by forces far greater than anything the eye can see. You are never alone, not for a single moment. The light of heaven surrounds you right now, filling every corner of your heart with warmth, with comfort, and with hope. May peace and divine blessing be with you today and in every day that follows. With infinite love. Amen.